Bonjour à tous.
Good morning to you all. So we'll start. Antoine Comte will join us very quickly, but we are already behind on schedule, so we'll start right away. So the topic of this second roundtable, in a way, is the following. The title is Generalization and Confusions, Identifying Them to Better Fight Them. So we hear many things about those topics today, meaningless things that are usually generalizations or confusions. We hear that people defending the rights of Palestinians are anti-Semitic people. We hear that the Jewish people in France or anywhere are opposed to colonization actually hate themselves. We hear that to define anti-Semitism today in France and Europe, we need to refer back to the attitude of people towards Israel. So that's the kind of thing we hear today, and these are all generalizations and confusions. So we'll discuss that. We will have 4 people and 4 different approaches on those topics. So our 4 speakers, I'll briefly present them because you all know them. Dominique Vidal, a journalist. Antoine Comte, who's here now with us. He's a lawyer. Fabienne Messica is a sociologist. And she's an activist working on the issues related to human rights in general, but in particular human rights issues in Palestine. And Pascal Boniface, whom I'm sure you all know, and who just published a book with the title Anti-Semite. So they will take the floor in turn. So first I'll ask Dominique Vidal to speak. We are already behind, so please be brief. You need to speak between 5 to 10 minutes. So the next roundtable is scheduled at 11, so we'll see if we can manage that. So we are behind. We start this roundtable 20 minutes after the plan, so please be as brief as possible. I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'm one of those who is preparing his contribution, so I'm just going to keep the schedules have been given. So on July the 16th, Emmanuel Macron was commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Veldiv Roundup. And not only had it invited the Israeli Prime Minister for the first time, not only had he called him Dear Bibi, but at the end of his great speech, he said, "We will not give up to anti-Zionism because this is the renewed form of anti-Semitism." That was the first time in the French history that a president had ever made that confusion, because he is confusing a crime, anti-Semitism, that is punishable by law, and an opinion contesting the character, the specificity of Israel, of Jews, and the need to all bring them together in the same state. Anti-Semitism, and before that anti-Zionism, have swept across Europe. For centuries, they have led to discrimination, massacres that can be linked to the Nazi genocide. As you all know, Holocaust has exterminated 50% of the European Jews and 30% of the international Jew community. In France, where the Vichy government and its police have actively contributed to the deportation of 75,000 Jews out of 230,000 Jews in France, anti-Semitism has kept losing ground. And more than ever, this is now a marginal ideology, while Islamophobia is a consensual is consensual. As Esther Benbassa said at the beginning of the 2000s, we've had record high of anti-Jews assault that is linked to the first Intifada. But since then, the number of anti-Jews assault has lost grounds. And that is also true when it comes to Islamophobic assault after 2015. Contrary to what some are claiming, people that are more politicians than sociologists, I'm thinking of Dominique Régnier, nothing can allow us to talk about a main of anti-Semitism that would be major in some category amongst with the Muslims. But the data cannot hide the true experience of people. It is true that now the anti-Semitic assaults are more violent than before. It's the first time since 1945 that Jews have been murdered because they were Jews. That was true in Toulouse as well as in Montreuil. That is true. The fight against racism and anti-Semitism is more than ever needed. And that requires us to be always very vigilant. And people that are claiming to be anti-Zionist need to be especially careful. All incitement to racial hatred needs to be fought and sanctioned. Our friend Antoine would be clearer about that. The law of 1881, of 1872, the Guesso law of 1990, and the Penal Code are now in France provide enough legal tool to sanction all this behavior. And what about the second point of comparison made by the president? Historically, at the end of the 19th century, the push of anti-Semitism brought about the birth of Zionism. Confronted to the pogroms of 1881, 1882 in Russia, then the Dreyfus affairs in 1895, the public opinion, Theodor Herzl, wrote a book and defended the idea that Jews needed their own state. During the first Congress, the first Global Zionist Congress, they said Zionism tries to bring about a publicly recognized home, legally guaranteed for the Jewish people in Palestine. 20 years afterwards, with the Balfour Declaration, the United Kingdom took on this program and created and decided to create the National Jewish Foyer in Palestine. But after the Second World War, the majority of Jews who left Russia went. Sorry.
La Palestine mandataire ne compte que 450 000 juifs, soit 2,5% de la population juive mondiale. Le génocide nazi bouleverse tout. 6 millions de juifs ont été exterminés.
2.5% of the Jewish community in the world. But the Nazi genocide, of course, changes everything. 6 million people were killed, and hundreds of thousands of survivors can no longer return home. Washington refuses visas to survivors, and a big number of them emigrate to Palestine, then Israel, where the war in 47 and 49 pushed out 800,000 Arabs. Now, of course, as during the period between the two world wars, the Jewish that emigrate to Israel did it by Zionist choice, by necessity rather than by Zionist choice. Now, 70 years later, and after numerous waves of immigration, Israel now has 6.5 million of Jews and the same number of Palestinians if you count the occupied territories. In the Western countries, the integration of the Jewish community goes along with a lot of marriages and weddings with non-Jewish individuals. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis have left their country. They don't no longer live in Israel. And in Berlin, there are over 100,000 Israelis who have left their country. And even for the French Jews who have left to Israel in order to do their aliyah, because they are scared of anti-Semitic assaults, there is still a great number of them who leaves again and goes back to France. Should we consider all of these who have resisted the appeal of Zionism as anti-Semites, or should we rather consider them as citizens who have decided to live their life in the country that they have adopted as being theirs? So historically, the phrase that was pronounced by the President of the Republic is not founded, and also it is very dangerous. It is dangerous for freedom of thought and freedom of expression. What Israeli executives and what the French executives are trying to do is clear. They are trying to criminalize any opposition to the Israeli policy because they know that they are alone. This appears clearly at UNESCO, at the General Assembly of the United Nations, and even at the International Criminal Court. A few weeks ago, the General Assembly of the UN voted for the self-determination of the Palestinian people. 176 voted for self-determination against 7. And in the 7 countries who voted against it, there were the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, and Palaus. The General Assembly of the United Nations also condemned the decision made by Donald Trump on Jerusalem. 128 votes against 9. And the isolation of Israel and of its allies will only increase. The right and the far right, who are in power in Tel Aviv, have been radicalizing in a very worrying way. They have used the Trump administration, and they have used their alliance with the so-called moderate Arab regimes in order to move on from colonization to annexation. Several acts will be adopted by the Knesset. And in the long run, Tel Aviv will definitely kill the two-state solution. There will only be a one-state solution where Palestinians will be annexated with their lands and they will not have the right to vote. This is what we would describe as being as an apartheid state. According to the polls currently, only 1/3 of Israelis are for the annexation of Palestinian territories. However, 69% of Israelis refuse, if there is annexation, that Palestinians have the right to vote. This policy certainly will not make the Israeli image better in the international scene. And this is why the far right in Israel and the allies in France want to ban any form of opposition. First target, the BDS campaign. There is no act or law which prohibits BDS. And so what is used is a ministerial order, which was issued by Michel Alliot-Marie. And it is only rarely that courts actually apply it. Usually, the activists that are accused are simply acquitted from any accusation. This happened in Montpellier recently. And they also use a decision given by the Cour de Cassation in France. However, the European Court of Human Rights could still do something about it. And the European Minister of Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini, keeps saying it once and again. The European Union is for the protection of the expression of the freedom of expression and freedom of association, which is in conformity with the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. This applies to the territory of member states of the European Union, and this also implies BDS action on such territories. What Emmanuel Macron said poses a risk that it would pave the way to banning anti-Zionism. In November, Francis Khalifa, the president of the CRIF organization in France, asked the Prime Minister that the definition, taking into account anti-Zionism as a new manifestation of anti-Semitism, be transposed in French national law. Can we imagine just 1 second for communists to ask for anti-communism to be banned, for Gaullists to ask anti-Gaullism to be banned, for neoliberals to ask for different views of the world to be banned? No, this is a totalitarian process of thought. Now, if this project were to actually be adopted, the Constitutional Council would, of course, block it. If it doesn't, it would be the first time since the Algeria War that France would once again criminalize opinion as an offense. The 10th article of the Declaration of Human and Citizen Rights in 1789 says the following: no one should be interrogated for their opinions, even if they are religious, provided that the manifestation of the opinion is not a problem for the public order as it is established by the law. The European Convention of Human Rights also stipulates in its Article 9 that every individual has the right to freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. And this right implies the freedom to change religions or to change convictions. And I can't, and I'm saying this here today, I refuse to believe that Emmanuel Macron would accept to be used by Israel in what is an attack against freedom. And I would like to add one thing. As personally, I don't feel like a loser, I have to say. And I would like to say that more our opponents are radicalized and the more alone they are. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, Dominique. Je ferai simplement...
Thank you, Dominique. I would just like to say one thing about history. As a historian, what Theodor Herzl wanted to have as the result of the Dreyfus case, Philippe Auriol has just has published recently a major book about this and highlighted that Herzl chose this story because Herzl had already, in fact, created his idea. And he just pretended that the Dreyfus case and that his stay in Paris actually sparked the idea of a Jewish home in Israel. But that was not true, in fact. And the French society, we know it because of this chapter of history. We know that the French society is capable of reacting and of responding against racism, against anti-Semitism, against the Israeli colonialism. Now, we have said a few things about whether it is banned to call for a boycott of Israel, and maybe Antoine Comte, our expert lawyer here will be able to shed some light on this issue. My colleagues, and Dominique Vidal specifically, said a lot of things, most of the things I wanted to say. But I'd like to say that the fight has just begun on freedom of expression. And contrary to popular belief, the decisions by the Cour de Cassation, who don't have a support in the expert lawyers, I would like to say that these decisions are not final. The Constitution in France, and there's the legislative body, protects us against this. And of course, there is also the possibility to really shed light on the important legal matters and take them to the European Court. And as long as the European Court has not given its final decision on how one should understand the call for boycott, then one cannot say that it is banned to call for boycott in our country. This is a sovereignist conception of the issue. It is not the reality. I would like to show you how important the European Court is on this. I have some statistics, some figures of the European Court. Ooh, apparently music I launched, I don't know. Yes, but I can tell that this is a very strong rhythm that we will be moving forward thanks to. So I used a few statistics of the European Court. I have a few figures here. Now, from 1959 to 2017, France was condemned over 700 times for violating principles in the convention, in the European Convention. In the European Convention, there are a certain number of rights which are enshrined that can't not be respected, except certain cases, and France was condemned over 700 times. But, of course, Russia comes in first, Poland, Ukraine, and Turkey, of course. And I have to say that Turkey is the big winner in this list. But if we put aside these countries, France is one of the founding fathers of the European structure, and it is one of the countries which is the most condemned by the European Court. Only Italy wins. However, the possibility of individual appeal in front of the court was instituted in France in October 1982. So, for France, the figures and the statistics span the period of 35 years, from 82 to 2017. And I'm not going to stop there. France was condemned for violating Article 10, which is at the heart of our conversation here today on the freedom of expression. And France was condemned for violating this article for 36 times, only behind Turkey for this one. Which means that decisions made by French executives are not final. When France is condemned, then what does that mean? Well, what is applied, or what was applied rather, is deleted or removed, or it is no longer applied, but is still existent. So an act which would harm freedom of expression would no longer be applied. So as I said, we are at the very beginning of our struggle, and I will tell you more about different possibilities that are offered to us in our struggle. Now, to answer the question, is there a law banning boycott in France? The answer is yes, but don't worry. There is such a law, but it's not an act that applies to the call for boycott. In the 70s, some French firms were trading with the State of Israel. However, the Arab League did require to not have any trade relations with the Israeli state. So there was a law adopted in the 70s for economic reason, and it was not a law adopted against citizens. So there is no act, no bill banning the call for boycott, a pacific and nonviolent call. And this is important to be reminded. We will not be a victim of a mediatic and judicial manipulation. And I'd like to remind you here of the cases of activists, and notably the Montpellier case. Firstly, I'd like to remind you that facts sometimes can be deformed. Now, in France, you do have a law that's very clear on, for example, certain slogans or wearing items of clothing with slogans. And this is something that is applied under what is called in France the act of the press. This is the only way that activists can be actually brought to court. Now, secondly, what is used against these activists is the content of the slogans. Now, what is being done when one calls for boycott? It is the criticism or the opposition against the state of Israel, the policy of a state. And in France, traditionally, one cannot take that to court. We are perfectly allowed to oppose the policy of a state. And this is exactly the case for example, the Old-Span campaign and the call for boycott against Russia or South Africa or China because of Tibet or Argentina when there was the World Cup. This is what this is about. We are talking about the political opposition of or against a policy, and the law cannot crack down against that. So what did they do? What they do is you are calling for boycott, and you are therefore discriminating against a population, not sure what that population is, and you are targeting these people because they make these goods that you're calling to boycott. And this is manipulation. And Léa Tsemel was saying, yes, acts and bills can make us move forward, but it can also take us back. So we know that we can't actually condemn or crack down on a call for boycott. However, what is done, the manipulation that is done, is presenting a call for boycott as a discriminatory act. Because of the fact that these are goods that are being boycotted, then the act of the press, as is it called in France, cannot be applied. And of course, individuals are not products until, we are proven the contrary economically. So there was a necessity to invent a group of people who would be the target of this call for hate speech and so on and so forth. This is a manipulation of the law, and this is something that was not accepted by the French courts. Now, of course, the French Court of Appeal made a certain decision, and then there was an appeal that went to the European Court. However, the courts in first instance did not actually accept this manipulation of French law. I'm going to give you some examples because some of them are very telling. So we have the Chamber of the Press, which we have a judgment which states that criticism against a state cannot be taken as an attack against a people without it having very severe repercussions for freedom of expression, especially that the interpreter would like to highlight that Mr. Comte is reading out loud a law text, that we don't have, which makes it difficult for us to interpret. Thank you. Now, essentially, the text, of course, is a judgment given in 2011. And in 2011, the Tribunal of Paris, and this was, of course, confirmed by the Court of Appeal, stated that there have been no criminalizations of call for boycotts. Now, let's move on to another case in Bobigny, near Paris. Article 24, paragraph 8, on discrimination and so on and so forth. Now, this is on discrimination against a group of people or an individual, which means that supposedly there is such a group. It also supposes that there is a government, a territory, and a state. And a state cannot be assimilated to a group of people or a group of individuals. We have legal experts who remind us constantly of the legal bases of our work. Material goods, even if they are made by people, cannot be equated to individuals and to people. Now, I would like to know in which Orwellian conception of the world one can say that goods and people are the same thing. And now, something that's quite amusing to me, if you look at the latest edition of the Criminal Code, Dallos's edition, if you look at the Article 24, paragraph 8, then you can find an acquittal decision, an acquittal judgment. It was stated by the court that the acts perpetrated by the individual were actually a manifestation of his opinion and not a discriminatory act. Once again, Mr. Comte is reading out a law text, which is difficult to interpret when you don't have it. It was considered at the time that the call for boycott was completely acceptable within the limits of the democratic debate, especially that expressing your political opinion is a necessity in a democratic society. And in this context, the call for boycott cannot be criminalized. Now, before I conclude, I would like to just remind you of a few things, and I'll try to be brief. I would like to remind you that when Michel Alliot-Marie was minister, I believe it was in 2010, I hope I'm not mistaken, and at the National Assembly, MPs started asking about these calls for boycott, and Michel Alliot-Marie said, I will not intervene as long as there are no violent acts. But a month after that, she was named Minister of Justice, and right after that, we had a decision, an order, which was written by her hand, on criminalizing the call for boycott. And this shows us how paradoxical the French political scene can be. Now, I'd like to talk about Urvoas. He is an MP from the region of Brittany. He came as a witness in a case on the conditions of detention for prisoners, and I was quite impressed by what he said. And in 2015, he is still an MP, and his circumscription members asked him about the issue of BDS, and he said, well, I will write to Madame Taubira, who had replaced Michel Alliot-Marie, unfortunately, because we respect her very much. And he said that for him, there was a clear difference, an actual gap between anti-Semitism and a call for boycott, of these goods. This is what he said in 2015. And of course, when we went to the European Court, his position, it seems, has changed. Once he became minister, well, he simply decided that he would change his mind, to put things simply. And the same person gave a written answer saying that, yes, we need to apply the Michel Alliot-Marie decision. We need to take these people to court because they called for a boycott, because this is a call for discrimination. What does this mean? This means that our politicians cannot be trusted, clearly, and we can't take their word for granted. This is a clear conclusion. However, let us try to move forward on the legal issues. I don't know if you read Intercept, but 3 days ago, a judge, not a federal judge in the United States, declared that the call for boycott is a fundamental right according to the American Constitution. Everywhere in the world, we have judgments and decisions that actually confirm this. And once again, our fight is only starting, and we cannot negotiate on freedom of expression. Thank you.
Just to follow up on what Antoine said, Madame Alliot-Marie, Miss Alliot-Marie, talked about the kosher products. But what we need to know is that a few weeks before that, at the National Assembly, she had been called upon to talk about that question, and she said, no, there are no boycott of kosher products. And 2 times she talked about that. Thank you very much for this legal perspective. Then there is another opinion on which our politicians are pretty much saying random things that do not make any sense, and that is on the definition of anti-Semitism. Some people in France would like to have an official definition of anti-Semitism that would refer back officially to the link with the attitude towards Israel. So, Fabienne, could you give us some information on that? As it was said before, the issues here are about democracy and freedom of expression in France. Freedom of expression is in danger now because of 2 different movements. First, I think there is a tendency at the state level where they would like to be able to tell us what history is and what we can think about history. For example, a few years ago, a group wanted us to say that colonization was a good thing. And I'm also thinking of the Gayso law. The Human Rights League was opposed to the Gayso law on the negationism. Not because we are against it, but denial. We are against the revision of history. We thought that it was very dangerous if the state were to start passing law on history and what we needed to think about history. Why? Because you know that the anti-racism movement is divided because for many reasons, because there are some competitions between the different actors. We do not have the same definitions of the different concepts. So this movement is divided, but we need to find a unity on the ground of universal principles. Is that movement divided because there are different communities? I think that the different community representations are part of the democracy. We can talk about how the community are represented, but we cannot we cannot really oppose how they are represented. The Jewish community have the CRIF. Well, they are not really lucky there, but they have the CRIF in France. The Muslim have the TCIEP. and so on and so forth. So the question of the representation of communities is an integrative part of the democratic debate. That is not a problem in itself. It's normal. We have to deal with it. We have to be able to go along with this universality of anti-racism. And that means that we need to accept all the representations of the different groups that are victims of racism. And that is why we need to accept all the specificities of the different groups. But I do believe we need to take into account what the different groups asks for. I don't think communitarism is an insult. We do not necessarily have to all defend the secular state, but when the CRAN took part in the movement to make sure slavery was recognized as a crime against humanity, the fact that the CRAN was part of that movement was not an issue at all. But when some pressure groups asks for a certain type of racism, here anti-Semitism, so for a specific type of racism, to have a specific definition given by a European body or by a national tribunal or organization, then we are right to worry. Firstly, because defining one type of racism cannot be accepted if we do not define all racisms. What does that mean? Well, let's say we do define what anti-Semitism is. Then that means we need to define Islamophobia, Arabophobia, the racism against the Rom community, the black people. So you realize that when we create all those definitions, we will put all the communities in a specific type of racism, and then they will be imprisoned in those concepts, in those legal concepts. And the law should not define the racism, the racist concepts. That is the work of the historian, journalists, all people analyzing those. We are defining those concepts by analyzing the history, by looking at the different racist opinions. Of course, we are doing that work, but this work needs to take into account the historical context that changes. This work is discussed by experts, so the law has nothing to do there. This work about defining the different racism is part of democracy. So it would be tragic for the racisms to be legally defined. That would mean we do not have universality in fighting against racism. If that were to happen, that would mean we would have many different racisms side by side, but then we wouldn't be able to find some bridges between the different fights. So as I said before, that would mean that we would also set in stone some representations. So why is that dangerous? That's why it's dangerous. And then it's also not possible. Why? Because the national and historical context are not the same. The concepts are not stable. When we can find different definitions according to what indicators we use. It's also dangerous for democracy. As I was saying, the moment now is very complicated when it comes to the universality of the fight against racism. Why? Because we need to redefine universalism by including the specificities. There is the question of inclusive anti-racism. So I'm not going to give you a lesson about that. But we are also at a point when the freedom of expression is endangered everywhere. In the universities, sometimes some discussions, meetings are forbidden because of an ideological point of view. We therefore we ban the academic reflection. We attack people working on some part of history. I'm not talking about revisionism there. That is something very specific that is not part of the study of history, but there are some issues, for example, slavery, colonization, that are very important. There are some very important pressure on those academic researchers. Also, pressure made on the artistic reflections. Also, pressure made by groups that would like to be the only one able to talk about the question of what does it mean to be a Jew, what does it mean to be a black, and I'm policing everyone else who tries to speak in my name, on my behalf. So all these questions are very important, and then there is the question of the fight against racism and the fight for the freedom of expression that are key and go hand in hand. We cannot fight against racism without fighting for the freedom of expression. As it was said before, anti-racism and democracy are linked. So all these issues are present, and today we need to fight against all confusions, all monopolies, representation monopolies, and we need to oppose them. It's okay and legitimate to have representations, but they cannot have a monopoly over the representation of any given community. We need to fight against the delegitimization of the critics of Israel. That is a part of our fight to make sure we do not lose ground on anti-racism and democracy. So just to conclude, when it comes to the IHRA definition, the definition is rather more subtle than what was said before. First of all, the term Zionist or anti-Zionist is not used. What they are doing is putting into question, well, there are 2, 3 or 4 articles defining anti-Semitism. They use tools we use in history, in the history studies, for example. And all the other articles are linked to Israel. But the term Zionist or anti-Zionism is not used in that definition. Instead, they used the right to self-determination of the Jewish people, which is not entirely the same. And then, secondly, of course, if we fight against this definition, which is something we need to do, we need to keep in mind the fact that the far right in France is hiding behind the concept of anti-Zionism to hide its own anti-Semitism. So we need to keep those facts in mind when we talk about those questions. We always need to clarify what is the context in which we are talking. And then my last point, we need to highlight the fact that in that definition, they wrote that assimilating the Jewish community to the Israeli policies is an indicator of anti-Semitism. But at the same time, the fact that you would critique Israel would also be anti-Semitism. So there is within that text a contradiction, because And we can say that this text is anti-Semitic in itself because this text is assimilating all the Jewish community to the state of Israel. So I think that is something we can clearly show by deconstructing the internal logic of that text. Thank you very much.
Oui, juste une phrase.
So before I give the floor to Pascal Boniface, I just wanted to follow up on the far right. Yes, it's true that part of the French far right is hiding his anti-Semitism behind being officially anti-Zionist, but there are also many people from the far right who are staunch supporter of the Israeli colonization in France. But that's not a contradiction. I just wanted to mention that. So Pascal Boniface. So thank you. Just to start, I just wanted to follow up on this small discussion between are we winners or losers. I think that in this past 16 years, the context has kept getting worsened, and now there are things that we can say and see that are worse now than they were 16 years ago. But even though that is true, we cannot define ourselves as losers because we are fighters, and fighters cannot be losers. You spend time fighting, you come to places such as here to talk within each other, and that is what fighting for justice means. So that means we are not really losers. So Dominique wrote a great book on anti-Semitism, but I think all these discussions hide the third point, and that is the critics of the Israeli government. And I think today, if we are criticizing the Russian government, nobody will be accused of being anti-Russian. If we are criticizing the Chinese government, we wouldn't be accused of being anti-Chinese people. But here the question, and that's the only case in the world, we are accused of being anti-Semitic because we are anti-Semite, because we are criticizing the Israeli government. Many of my colleagues that are experts in geopolitical issues are criticizing very heavily the policies of Donald Trump, and yet they are not accused of being anti-American. So in France, we see that we can assimilate the critics towards a government and equates it to criticizing a community, a people. So officially, there are two aims. I very often say when I fight against anti-Semitism assaults, I'm an ally to people that can also support the Israeli government. And yet, because I do not support the Israeli support,ment, they do not want my help. And I find it very contradictory because when the house burns, you do not really look at who is bringing water to the house. You welcome all help. But here, all those who are supporting the Israeli government can be welcomed, but all those who dare to criticize the Israeli government are not welcomed in the fight against anti-Semitism. Of course, we are not putting into question the fact that anti-Semitic words exist and actions exist, and we know that some people use anti-Zionism to hide themselves, but these are minorities. Most of the organizations, well-known organizations that act in solidarity with Palestine, are very, very careful when it comes to anti-Semitism. They do not accept anyone even bordering on using anti-Semitic words. But I do not really have the feeling that in the organization in support of Israeli government, they are so careful with the way they talk about Muslims, for example. So we can see that there is a double standard here. Today, luckily in France, it's forbidden to be anti-Semitic in the public sphere. So while during the Second World War, but even in the 60s and 70s, we could hear anti-Semitic words in the media, on TV, in the radio. But that's not the case now. But we can attack Muslim people. We can attack a young woman on the street because she wears the veil, for example. That's okay. So the words, the Islamophobia is present in political discussions, even in the National Assembly, in the media, without any bad consequences on the careers of people uttering those words. On the diplomatic front, I wouldn't be that optimistic. When we look at the situation compared to the beginning of the 2000s, Europe and France are less active. They are not supporting the creation of a Palestinian state as much as they did before. The Arab states have just disappeared. China has good relations with Israel. Russia also has very good relations with Israel, and Israel created new links with Africa. Maybe Latin America is resisting there, but otherwise, on the world stage, Israel made won a lot of victories on the diplomatic front. We all know, I know dozens of journalists, academics, politicians who say, I agree with you on the question of Israel-Palestine, but I would never speak up because they are afraid of the consequences in France. But what are the risks? Well, we are not really being resistant there. The consequences are not so dire, so I think we can still act. But the worst is that even though Israel won some victories on the diplomatic front, it lost grounds when it comes to the public opinions in the civil society. Israel is not so supported now. And I call on the AFPS to go to universities because I think many young people would support you. I see the students, my own students. Okay, maybe some people can say I'm influencing them, but that's not true. When I go as a guest lecturer to other universities, even business schools, not only in the north region of Paris, the support movement is really vast. And I think AFPS should go to universities. But this is dangerous because there is a big difference between the actual country and the countries as it is thought of. Now we know that it can be very complicated to be invited to a conference because of something you may have said on Twitter or on the media. But we need to be careful about self-censorship because that can fuel the conspiracy theories. And all these accusations of being anti-Semitist and anti-Muslim sentiment as well, that all these can fuel the conspiracy theories. Look at how there have been a young woman who has been accused of being who has been accused because she wore the veil while she sang. And we can see, and accused of defending terrorism because she wore the veil. We need to be careful of those kind of things because these are confusions made, and we need to fight that. The Palestinian people are very resilient, and we know that the current government, Palestinian government, will not start negotiations or find a solution right away. So sadly, the conflict will remain. And we can say that in France there is a big contradiction because they are asking the Jewish community to fully support all decisions made by the Israeli government, and that is not very normal. So we need to make sure that we need to fight against the fact that the French public opinions are being influenced by all those people who say that we cannot import the conflict in France.
J'ajouterais deux petites remarques.
Thank you. I would add 2 observations, maybe 2 questions, so that then we can pick up on all of this. When we talk about anti-Semitism, wouldn't you say that there is a return of anti-Semitism in the French society? And I think of Charles Maurras and this re-edition, which was published, a different publication of anti-Semitic pamphlets. These were published by Gallimard recently. So can't we say that anti-Semitism, French anti-Semitism, is also at play in a very insidious manner? Of course, things are not clearly said, not the way it was done during the period between the 2 wars. So that's one question. But then I also have another observation. We were told before that an Israeli flag was burned. And during the Vietnam War, I was of that generation, and maybe some of you as well, who had burned the American flag during demonstrations against the Vietnam War. Now, can we say it's the same thing? This is the question I'd like to ask. Given the status of the United States of America and given all of this Israel-Palestine issue, this is a question that I'm asking. It is not a confirmation. I would say objectively that it should be the same, but at the same time, it does pose a few questions.